70 years ago, when you were just a little girl, you and your parents became refugees when the Soviet army began to move toward your home in Lithuania. You wound up in Germany, and you spent 3 frightening and chaotic years in a displacement camp before you finally arrived in America. How has this family history, which is your history, shaped your life, your thinking, and ultimately your work?
Oh my goodness. Well, you're always an immigrant. You're always not quite 100% American, even though I feel totally American. The history of the World War II, kind of what my family went through, has really been an enormous part of my life because my homeland, Lithuania, was under communist Soviet occupation for more than 50 years. And my father was very active in the independence movement to try to get independence back. And my whole childhood was really framed around we're Lithuanian, we have to get our homeland back. One day we will return. To say nothing of the fact of my name. Every time I introduce myself, people would say, "What kind of name is that? Where are you from? Were you born here? Oh my goodness, it's so interesting." So I had an opportunity to, I didn't want to talk about myself, but I did want to talk about my country and make sure that people were aware of what happened because those 3 Baltic countries that were occupied in 44, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, were basically taken off the map. We weren't even, I mean, sometimes there were little dotted lines around the countries. But, and that, I think that kind of refugee mentality, which is you never know what the next day will bring, a slight, feelings of insecurity, and especially, since I was, with my parents, they were tremendous security for me, but we didn't know where we were going. We didn't know where we would end up. And this has made me extremely sympathetic and empathetic towards anybody else who's lost their home and their homeland and have had to flee violence or economic deprivation. Anybody who's had to give up their land, their home, and often their families because of world crises led me to get involved in refugee work over the years. So that was, one way, a very big way that it impacted. And after independence in 1991, my father went back. He started a business. He bought a home. And we started a family foundation, which I am the president of. So I am going back to Lithuania a few times a year. We're very involved in educational and cultural causes. And it is now my life's work to run this foundation, do what I can to help Lithuania with its economic stability and the young people who are there now.
But your work with refugees is taking you much further than Lithuania. Where around the world has this commitment taken you?
Well, I was fortunate to go on the board of the Women's Refugee Commission, which started out as part of the International Rescue Committee, IRC. And we obviously operate all over the world on behalf of women and children whose needs are very often overlooked as men have the power structures in a lot of these third world countries. So I've been to Rwanda shortly after the genocide, to Bosnia after the Dayton agreements, Afghanistan when the Taliban were in power, to the Congo, to um, assist the women who were survivors of terrible rapes that occurred there. So the world now is fraught with so many problems. Most recently, I went to the eastern countries of Europe where the flow of migrants was coming from Syria through Greece and all the way through Europe, through Serbia and Slovenia, on the way to Germany. Everybody wanted to go to Germany. And even my small country, Lithuania, less than 2 million population, we have had several hundred Syrian refugees come through our borders as well.
Well, working in so many dangerous places, what are some of the conditions and the obstacles that you faced working in those countries?
Well, let's not overestimate the dangers. I mean, when you go with a group like the Women's Refugee Commission or the IRC or the United Nations groups, you have wonderful security and you live in a nice hotel, and obviously you go out during the day to the camps and meet with the refugees, but there's really limited hardship. Though I must say that going to Kabul at the height of the Taliban power was an interesting experience. So we had to cover up and hide in the back of the Jeep as the Taliban were going around with their guns and searching for any women who were exposing their faces or being seen. So even I, as an American, had to follow the regulations of the Taliban.
With work with refugees, can you feel that some of your work has made a real difference to make a lasting change, especially in the lives of the women and children?
You know, I I worry about that. I've been involved in this work now for 25 years, and we go to a new place, and it's just like we have to reinvent the wheel. Women need separate showers and latrines, especially Muslim women who have such a sense of their privacy and their modesty, that there need to be special places for women to go and nurse the children. And the children need diapers and formula, and the women need sanitary products. And it just seems that here we go again. Why are people overlooking these very basic needs of women and children? So, I should probably be a little bit more optimistic. Let's put it this way. The WRC is an advocacy group. I think people are waking up more to the problems facing women and children in these situations. And obviously, in our own country, the most recent example of children being separated from their parents at the borders, where we have been very, very active, especially on gender-based violence. There's things going on at the border where women really are at risk. And as you know, a mother will do anything to save her child. And if she has to sell her body, they will do it. And we have definitely been looking at situations like that which persist.
I like to look back at your life. You graduated Trinity College, you became a magazine researcher, but at the age of 24, with the war raging in Vietnam, you made a decision, an amazing decision, that changed the course of your life. What was it?
Well, um, it did. I don't know whether it changed the course of my life, but let's put it this way. It certainly is one of the defining characteristics that people seem to find very interesting. Like, how could you do that? I mean, in the middle of the war, and started me thinking, was I just plain dumb. I mean, how could I? My parents were horrified. Everybody was horrified. I had a good job at Look magazine, and I just announced I was going. I did try to affiliate with a, Newsweek, or I asked Look to send me. I went around to all the big news agencies, and they said, "Who are you? You don't have enough experience. It's too dangerous." So I decided to go on my own. And why did I go to Vietnam? Because I knew that I wanted to be a journalist, and this was the biggest story of the day. I mean, it just dominated the newspapers. We're talking about 1967, day after day after day. And it was my generation that was fighting the war. It was 18, 19, 20-year-olds going over there, drafted, being sent over, not really understanding the politics, not understanding why, and people killing each other. And I was so fascinated by this concept of war. Why is it only men really fighting the war? Why is it only men covering the war? Why are there so few women writing about this really rather horrendous reality of our life? So that's kind of what motivated me to go.
But how did you actually get the money to get there?
Oh, well, everybody loves this story. I mean, I was earning, what, $60 a week at Look magazine, and my parents just said, you're on your own here. So I went on a quiz show called Password, and I won $500, and that was enough for a one-way ticket to Saigon. And off I went, and I had a little bit of money saved up, and it was not expensive at all to live in Saigon. I crashed with some people that I met, and then I started basically going out into the field to do combat coverage, and would go for days without having to pay for a hotel room or food or anything like that.
But how were you received when you arrived?
Well, I was a freelancer, and I was female. And that's like a double whammy, get out of here. The male press corps did not really show any kind of respect, understandably. I mean, what are your credentials? And you just don't show up there. I had to apply with the American officials and the Vietnamese officials to get my press credentials. I had letters from kind of obscure little publications and story assignments that got me over there. And once you got your press card, and the American military learned their lesson from this, once you got your press card, you had carte blanche to go all over the country. You could go on helicopters, you could go on bombers, you can go on aircraft carriers, you can show up anywhere. And there were very, very few women full time. Occasionally, the celebrities would come in, like Oriana Fallaci. She came for a month or so. Renata Adler came from the New Yorker for a week or two. So it was an interesting, challenging, and extremely difficult time of my life.
Well, I'd like to quote you. You said, "You became a feminist in Vietnam when the officers invited you to dinner, but not to the front line. What did it take to overcome the antagonism toward women so you finally got these frontline assignments?"
Well, you could back channel. In other words, the commanding officer, say at Quezon, said, you had to be on a list, and New York Times has priority, and you're standing in the airfield, and you see a helicopter, and you say to the pilot, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Well, actually, I'm going to Quezon, and the helicopter's empty." And you say, "Can I have a ride?" And they go, "Sure." Some 18-year-old, "Sure, it's kind of cool. This, girl coming on my helicopter." And, I had been there for a while. So the other journalists knew me. but um, it was not easy, and I write in a book that I wrote with several other uh, reporters from Vietnam. It was a very, very lonely time. We didn't really bond as sisters, except for one moment when Westmoreland decreed that women could not overnight at on the front lines, which of course basically said you can't get a story. I mean, you just fly in, you interview some people, and you leave. You want to walk with them, you want to be on patrol with them, you want to get to know these soldiers, and we lobbied the Defense Department with letters and complaints, and it got a little publicity, and the ban was rescinded.
Well, if you don't mind to tell us about the big one, the Battle of Khe Sanh. You did arrive there in helicopter as well. How were you greeted when you arrived there?
The Marines, the young Marines were fine with it. I think most of all, we have to know they're doing their job. They're focused on their job, and I was always very, very sensitive about, not intruding. If somebody's digging a trench, I'm not going to bother them. And I had gotten assignment from WOR Radio to interview some New Yorkers because the siege had been going on now almost 2 months, and it was day after day after day of rocket attacks from the North Vietnamese over on the other side of the DMZ. So I was, walking around with my tape recorder, anybody here from New York and what have you, and the guys were extremely gracious and kind, and they were just lovely. And the commanding officer was not happy that I was there, but he said, "Well, you're there. I'm going to have to put up with you." And unfortunately, on March the 8th, it had been quiet for 3 or 4 days, meaning they were getting an isolated rocket here or there. It wasn't the barrage of sometimes 50, 75, 100 rounds of artillery coming from the other side. It had been quiet. The weather had kind of lifted. It was a sunny day. Everybody was kind of shedding their wet clothes. People were kind of feeling, oh, maybe the siege is over. And then all of a sudden, I'm interviewing somebody, and we heard that whistle, that telltale coming in from all different areas. And I made the fateful mistake, as did several other guys, of running to the nearest bunker. What you're supposed to do, for those who want to know, when you hear incoming, is to flatten yourself on the ground, because the likelihood of a direct hit on your body is really minimal. But the likelihood of a rocket or artillery exploding with the shrapnel going at 45 degrees in all directions, you're going to get hurt. So 4 of us did get hurt. We did get pieces of shrapnel. One was quite seriously wounded in his foot, and then they did some surgery while I was there, and then I was evacuated that evening.
Well, you did help make history in Vietnam. You became one of 4 women whose reporting from Vietnam became truly iconic. 40 years after the war, all 4 of you were interviewed at the News Museum here in D.C. Who were the other women?
Oh, these are my co-authors, I believe, would be Laura Palmer, who worked for ABC, Edie Lederer, who covered the war for the Associated Press, Tracy Wood, who was there for UPI, Kate Webb, who was working for Reuters and UPI, and in Mariano, I forget precisely which four were there for, because we did a lot of panel discussions when the war came up. But I would not use the word iconic. I was not Marguerite Higgins. We didn't achieve any kind of status, but I think we were pioneers in a small way, because we were determined to do a job. We didn't let our sex interfere. We lobbied to get these assignments, and I think now, while we were these rare birds, now nobody even bats an eye when they see a woman with a flak jacket and a helmet reporting from whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. It's just taken for granted. And now more than half of the journalists who are covering combat and crisis situations around the world are female. And it's taken 40 years to get to this point, but so I do think we started a little bit of equality among war correspondents.
And you did it in a war that was one of the most unpopular wars in history. How did you, as a group of women, look back on that experience?
Uh, well, I can only speak for myself. I think that I'm very glad I went, in the sense that to see firsthand the brutality of war. I never wanted to cover another war. I had no interest. I said, I am done. I came back and I covered another war between men and women as women fought for their equality. Uh, but I think that it was very, very difficult in the things that we saw, and it was really kind of hard to live with. Coming back and encountering the very vocal anti-war movement, and hearing people chanting, Ho Chi Minh will win, and being so hostile towards American soldiers was very, very painful for me, because, like I said, so many of these young people who lost their lives there, more than 50,000, they didn't know what they were doing there. They went because their country asked them to serve, and they went willingly, and they died for it, tragically, never really understanding what they were fighting for. And it just made me very, very, very sad that they were spat upon when they came home. There were no parades. There was no welcoming. I mean, how many stories have we heard of soldiers taking their uniform in the airport bathroom, being afraid to walk through a terminal, wearing their uniforms in the late 60s and 70s, when the anti-Vietnam movement was at its height. Though I understood the passions of those people, and I think now we know that our government did lie to us, and we were even aware of that when we were in Vietnam. You'd be out in the field, and then you'd come back to Saigon the next day, and they would report on the battle that you witnessed, and they always exaggerated the number of enemy killed, the number of weapons captured, minimized American casualties, and it just didn't fit. And we had some very, very brave reporters from the New York Times and other prestigious newspapers being relentless about getting the truth out.
Vietnam, of course, now has opened up not only to tourism, but as a financial hub in Asia. Have you gone back there since?
Yes, I went back in 1995 on the 20th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, with about 60 or 70 journalists who covered the war. And I even went back to Khe Sanh, which was a very emotional trip. Uh, Everything that remained of that incredible Marine base was gone. There was nothing. It was all coffee, all one big, beautiful coffee plantation. There was a memorial there for all the North Vietnamese people who died, and outrageous comments about American casualties, total lies. But it just made me happy to see the country at peace. The new young generation had no hostility at all towards Americans. They've moved on, and that's a lesson for all of us to be able to forgive that way.
After the war, you returned to the States and you landed a job as a reporter for the Associated Press. What was the atmosphere like there for women reporters, and what major assignments were you given?
Well, I was very, very lucky because I started working at the Associated Press in early '69, and it was the start of the kind of feminist movement, the women's liberation movement. And newspapers were being sued for sex discrimination, and they were very, very sensitive about having women's pages and doing just, weddings and fashion shows, and everybody kind of was shifting to this lifestyle coverage. And at the same time, my generation was taking over society, not only with the anti-Vietnam movement and the women's movement, but the environmental movement, sex, drugs, rock and roll, dropping out, alternative lifestyles. And the Associated Press created this new department, which was called Living Today. Not the women's news, Living Today. And there were 6 of us who were hired, all, under the age of 30, who were hired to go around the country to report on these trends and changes. And my colleague Lynn Schur was there at that time. And we just had so much fun covering sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and it was a very, very exciting time. So we were kind of the elite in the AP in the sense that this new department that had amazing resources. We could travel. We had the luxury of doing feature stories, so you could have, you could work for 2 weeks on a story, none of this terrible deadline of having to file 2 or 3 times a day. So I never experienced any kind of discrimination or sexism or anything in the department. The AP was nothing but generous and giving us kind of just, a ticket to ride out there.
And am I wrong in saying that you also did cover the Carter White House? Is that true?
Yes.
And reporting on the Mideast as well.
Yes. I did cover First Lady Rosalind Carter, the East Wing of the White House, and then they sent me to Egypt for the Mideast War. And it took forever to get there because airports were closed. And when we got there, the war was over. The 6-day war was over. But I spent a month in Egypt anyway, trying to get kind of a follow-up on what was happening there.
You mentioned Lynn Schur, who you met and became lifelong friends with. You met her at AP. She was not yet the future TV pioneer broadcaster that she became. And together, you and Lynn co-authored a number of groundbreaking feminist works. 2 of them I have right here, as a matter of fact. Please talk about some of your many projects, particularly the Liberated Woman's Appointments book, which is just fascinating, and the research that you've done
Oh,
has
yeah,
been is
that was
amazing.
such a great time. I think the first edition came out in 70, but I think it was February, and it was George Washington's birthday. We had a holiday for George Washington's birthday, and we kind of looked at each other and we said, why can't we have, a holiday for a woman sometime? And we looked at each other and we said, well, how do we even know what dates are associated to women? And at the time, Jim Fixx, the running guru, had released the running calendar, and which was amazingly popular. And we said, well, why don't we do a woman's calendar? And we proceeded to go through every single book in the library on the lives of women, especially famous women, i.e. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, kind of those names that were kind of known to people. And then at the same time, the world was changing, that all of a sudden, first female rabbi, first female jockey, first female umpire, first female airlines pilot. All of a sudden, there were these female firsts that were like happening week after week. So we started gathering every time we read, even in Japan, of somebody, first female to climb Mount Everest. I mean, just getting all those statistics. And then we had, wonderful pictures and the whole thing. And we did 10 years until about 1980, when Lynn went on to fame and very, very busy life as a television correspondent. And our publisher just said, it's kind of had its run here. So, but meanwhile, then we did the American Women's Gazetteer, because after doing the dates of famous women, we said, well, what about the places where women made history? And, we knew a few places like Harriet Beecher Stowe's house in Hartford, and we found Susan B. Anthony's house in Rochester. So we proceeded to do a state-by-state guide, 50 states, took more than a year of travel and research and reaching out to tiny little county libraries saying, do you have any historic houses related to women who made history in your county? All this while we have full-time jobs, all this. And it was just such a happy time to have this great project. Lynn was always at the typewriter. She was a very, very fast typist. And we would, be in the thesaurus, grabbing the thesaurus. Oh, we need another word. We can't use the word people. No, you can never say people. We got to use another word. And typing it and putting it together. It was, and I think we really did a service, because after that, of course, everybody started, writing about the women's movement and history of women's movement. But we were definitely the first out there. And I'll never forget, Betty Friedan loved her women's calendars. We went from the Liberated Women's Appointment Calendar and Survival Handbook and Field Manual to just the woman's calendar. And she would lug them all around. And I think, from what I understand, she donated them to the Schlesinger Library. I'm not sure who has Betty's papers. But anyway, the 10 years of calendars she kept. And one of the interesting evolutions was, originally we had one page for a week. And then people said, I'm a very busy woman. This is not big enough for me to write down all my appointments. So then we did 2 days to a page. And, and kind of sensitive to, I do stuff. I just don't write down, lunch and, whatever. But it was really a wonderful time. And Lynn was just the best partner, the best partner.
Well, I went through the Women's Gazetteer, They're available still on Amazon
Oh my
because
gosh.
I got the calendar on Amazon for 1973 and the
Oh,
Gazetteer, and I have never seen more amazing research. I don't know how you
oh
did it in a
yeah,
year. It would have
yeah.
taken most people 10
That's
years to
right.
do
That's
it.
right. And then when Lynn came to me and she said, Jurate, we need to update the Gazetteer. I said, are you kidding? She said, no, no, no. Plus, she said, I always hated that title. So we came up with Susan B. Anthony Slept Here. So the Gazetteer became twice as thick because we had more places and became, the title was much, much more catchy and it was really a lot of fun.
And right now, what are you and Lynn working on to publicly honor great women from our own history? The campaign that's being conducted right now.
Oh, the statue in
Yes.
Central Park. Yes. Well, she's on the board of it, and I lent my 5 cents to donate to get a statue of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in Central Park. And Lynn wrote some wonderful op-ed pieces on the need for why do we really need a statue for more pigeons to roost on, what's really important, why that visual concrete presentation honoring a woman is so significant. So in other words, the battle kind of never really ends, and I think what we're seeing today with the Me Too movement is just so powerful, and it's a definite outgrowth of the women's movement where women were empowered to speak out and respect themselves and have a say in their own lives. I must say, though, it distresses me horribly when I think 50 years ago, 40 years ago, I was writing stories, as was Lynn, on the need for childcare, flex time, flexible work days, so women could, work 4 days a week and be home with their kids. Life, work, and family balance. We're still talking about how do I manage a career and a family? What do I do? It's like, oh, can you believe it? We're still talking about it, to say nothing of reproductive rights. I mean, if you had told me that today we would be worried about the repeal of Roe versus Wade 20 years ago, I would say, no, it's the law of the land. I mean, it's like a no brainer. People know you can't force a woman to give up control of her body. It's extremely frustrating and distressing.
Now, looking back at the great second wave feminists, which leaders, authors, activists, journalists, and visionaries do you most admire and why?
Oh my goodness. Well, the list is long, but I have to really start with Betty Friedan. I really do. She was a lone voice out there, and it just she was such a visionary. She saw that, she captured the moment, and I remember calling her up all the time. Betty, I need a quote for my story. She said, oh, you're right, you know what I want to say. You just say it. You just say it. Betty, I can't do that. I can't make up a quote. Just give me a quote. And she would just rattle off the most brilliant, concise, compelling argument. Um, I must say that I admire Gloria Steinem a lot, because she has just been so dignified through all this. She never wanted to be the leader, and the press was always looking for a spokesperson, a leader, and her pithy comments, her one-liners are just brilliant. And obviously, going back to history, we have to acknowledge all the suffrage leaders, and I'm looking forward to 2020 when we can really celebrate all those women in the 19th century who were out there trudging from coast to coast trying to get, equality for women. And I really have to praise all those unheralded women, those women who work in factory jobs and wake up every day, and single moms who have to feed their kids and keep a job and take care of the children, sometimes two or three jobs. I mean, these are the real heroines of America and of the women's movement.
Well, I was going to ask you what the most important issues were to be fought or probably refought by today's young feminists, but I think you really have summed it up. And a final question about 2020, when we will celebrate Susan B. Anthony, and the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. What do you think about this is our final question, what do you think about the influence of the women's vote in our next presidential election?
Huge. I think the importance of the women's vote is huge. Number one, there's no such thing as women's issues. All the things that are important to women, like family leave and paternity leave and health insurance, all those are things that are very, very important to men too. And I'm really keeping my fingers crossed. And it's really up to us to get out there and register more women, encourage them to speak out, and also to run for office. That is critical. I mean, women have to bite the bullet and just start out in the school board, work their way up, and get into office so we can really have parity in the houses in Congress. And I just am really very, very hopeful that we have seen a really significant change, and looking forward to, I think, a big celebration in 2020, and just hoping that we will get a woman in the White House in my lifetime, which I think we will.
Thank you so much, and thank you for revealing so much of yourself.
Oh, my pleasure. And really, this is such an amazing project, and it's important that we never forget those struggles of 40, 50 years ago and 100 years ago.